Alrighty. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to today's Healthy Shift Worker episode. I'm really excited today because today's guest is going to be speaking to us all about the vagus nerve, and it is with educator and clinician Emrys Goldsworthy from Brisbane here in Australia. Emrys has been in clinical practice for over 16 years and has also been a senior lecturer in myotherapy and musculoskeletal therapy at Endeavour College of Natural Health here in Brisbane for close to a decade. His particular focus is on the area of treatment in the nervous system, which I'm excited to hear his thoughts on that for us highly frazzled shift workers, with a special interest in the vagus nerve, which actually led to the recent launch of his book, The Vagus Nerve, Unleashing the Body's Secret Weapon Against Disease. So welcome to the show, Emrys. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Really glad to be here.
Great. I'm glad that we're able to tee up a time, I guess. But first and foremost, though, I mean, congratulations with the recent publication of your book. That's super exciting news. You must have a weight off your shoulders to have that out there now.
Yeah, well, it was a long time coming. I should have done it years ago, but finally got the time to put it all together.
Yep.
All the years of research and clinical training that I was doing with people. And also now, unfortunately, I will need to write another book because there is a lot more that I didn't include because of more recent research I've done, but also experience that needs to be added into it as well. But, you know, one book at a time. And my wife will thank me not to go straight back into writing again. So maybe next year I'll start writing the next one, which I think will be exciting as well.
Yeah, you got to have a bit of a breather in between.
Yes.
as well. But it's great. It's great news. So I guess before we really dive into the nitty-gritty of things, I'm really excited to have you on today, Emrys, because I think if we take a bigger picture perspective on the health of the vast majority of health shift workers, one of the biggest underlying drivers is, or from their health challenges, I guess, is this dysregulated or overstimulated nervous system due to many things. I guess the foundational big ones are that sleep disruption and disruption to our circadian rhythm or our innate circadian rhythms. But before we dive down that path, could you share a little bit about yourself, your journey, like what led you to because I know you have an interesting background that's completely not into the health sphere. What led you down to the path of studying myotherapy, even eventually lecturing in musculoskeletal therapy, and then obviously your focus on the nervous system?
Well, my first career, of many are aware, I was a classical ballet dancer with the Royal New Zealand Ballet Company, and then due to many factors, I decided to retire early. It was the right time for me in my career. And then I went and studied myotherapy after that. It was musculoskeletal therapy at the time. And really got into dealing with muscles and joints and pain syndrome, sports injuries, things like that. And then once I graduated, I got offered a lecturing role and it kind of blossomed from there as far as academia is concerned. And I got into other areas of interest, nervous system, neuroscience later on, and started teaching in neuroscience. And I was the main writer for neuroscience in the course, as well as every other kind of third year, final year subject. But neuroscience became my passion, you could say. And as I went along, I often started to work more with nerves as a result of that interest, and did more research in nerves and nerve entrapments and neuropathy and just different ways of treating nerves, and kind of found my own approach along with kind of learning from others along that journey. I kind of developed my own approach to treating nerves using a variety of methods, hands-on approaches, as well as using lasers and shockwave and all sorts of other modalities. And really started only treating nerves with every patient of mine, and found that results were far better than treating quote unquote joints and muscles, which is how I was trained.
Mm.
So I really kind of had to do a lot of unlearning, lose the kind of orthopedic approach, which was now being pretty much disproven as an accurate way of assessing the body anyway. But back then it was still quite mainstream to use an orthopedic examination. And now I predominantly work with nerves. But there was a period of time where I was doing a lot of work with naturopaths and nutritionists and other clinicians where they had patients with gut problems, and we wanted to see how we could integrate our work, treat one patient in our own way, integrative approach. And I thought to myself, well, it's possible that I could help actually doing the same things that I do for other nerves in the arms and the legs and wherever, but to nerves that go to the gut. Maybe it's possible. Then I realized, well, that's the vagus nerve. And that led to other things like the heart, like issues with tachycardia and arrhythmia, issues with the lungs, such as asthma. And then it turns out, well, there's actually a lot of literature on this, I found. And then the deep dive started, and it just didn't really stop because there are so many people interested in this topic in almost every field, from psychology to gastroenterology to even things relating to sleep. Sleep doctors are interested in it now. Issues with the lungs, so pulmonary specialists, things like that. And I thought to myself, well, for something with so much interest, there's got to be something in it. And I found that you can actually do a bunch of different therapies that were very well researched with randomized controlled trials. And I started implementing them in my own clinical practice and found great success. And because the field is so new, I had to find ways of assessing the vagus nerve that wasn't really available, that anyone could really were talking about in the literature. So I had to develop my own methods. And so since then, I have developed my own examination methodology and procedure, which allows me to understand really where the problem is in the vagus nerve. Vagus nerves can be compressed or damaged, or the entire nervous system is in some ways dysregulated, mostly due to damage in those cases, and figuring out where it all starts. And I've got to the point now where I'm far more comfortable knowing where that is and knowing why. This vagus nerve is a pretty complicated nerve. It's unlike any other nerve in the body because it innervates more stuff, more things. It innervates muscles of the throat, but it innervates organs, whereas most nerves don't do that. So this nerve is very unusual. And so when you get a compression syndrome, bit of damage in it, as minor as it is, it turns out it's pretty devastating. So it became my obsession, you could say, alongside treating normal musculoskeletal pain syndromes and sports injuries. And now, it got to the point where the book was written, and here we are. It's a bit of a long road to get here, but I can tell you my passion is the vagus nerve and the autonomic nervous system as a whole.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like it's been a journey. That's for sure. That's for sure. So I guess let's go back a bit because obviously we've got listeners from a variety of backgrounds. Can you explain to us what actually is the nervous system and obviously and how that vagus nerve, I guess, interlies in that, and what happens when the body becomes out of sync, or when that nervous system, becomes out of sync?
Yeah. Okay. So there's lots of ways of explaining the nervous system. Let's go through some of those just to get to grips with how neuroscience explains it. The body is divided either functionally or structurally. You have your central nervous system, maybe you've heard of that. That's your spinal cord and brain. Then you have your peripheral nervous system. That's everything else pretty much that comes off the brain stem or the spinal cord. Your nerves in your arms and your legs and your neck and your face and head and so on. Then you have these sort of other divisions. One is called the somatic nervous system, and that's basically the nerves that go to your muscles and your skin and things that are functionally you're conscious of doing. So like moving your arms, that's all somatic. Then there's this thing called the autonomic nervous system, And there are other ways of dividing this actually, but I'll just keep it to the more common. Autonomic nervous system is essentially our non-conscious system, okay? And a large amount of brain activity is associated with it, but it's not really. The brain is not included in the autonomic nervous system. It's just that the brain activities precede activities in the autonomic nervous system. So just be aware that we are humans. We have incredible brain function that precedes most things, and that includes emotions are generated, as far as we're aware, in the brain, in our limbic system. I won't go into that too much, but then autonomic nervous system gets involved thereafter. Autonomic nervous system's role is mainly two things: survival and procreation. If it doesn't do those two things, it essentially is failing as a system. As far as survival is concerned, it's involved in regulating intake of oxygen through the lungs. It's involved in digestion of food so that we can get resources and energy. It's involved in essentially the elimination and detection of toxins, which we can go into. That's actually probably because of its survival, right? So if we consume something toxic, well, the autonomic nervous system activates. Both sides, there are two sides to this autonomic nervous system. One is called the sympathetic nervous system. This is our so-called quote-unquote fight or flight system, which in itself is probably not quite accurate. Then there's another one called the parasympathetic nervous system, and this is our quote-unquote rest and digest system. But, unfortunately, these terms, fight or flight, rest and digest, are actually not quite accurate, because it suggests that the systems are polar or opposing, completely opposing, which they're not. And it also suggests that they are binary. There's one or the other active. Well, that's not true at all, actually. The sympathetic nervous system is predominantly active throughout the day. Because if you don't have it active, you're not very much awake. If you don't have good sympathetic activity, so people who tend to be tired throughout the day tend to have low sympathetic nervous system activity. And that's just for lots of different reasons. But the other thing that you'll see is that, while that's the case, somebody eats something and that activates their opposing, the parasympathetic nervous system. And the main structure in that parasympathetic nervous system is the vagus nerve. And you could just say the vagus nerve is the parasympathetic nervous system, because it probably makes up at least 95 to 90% of it. So that's the predominance of its activity. And this nerve, or nerves, really, it's lots of nerves, it's involved in so many processes that, a lot of the time they're both active. So the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system active at the same time to complete certain things. So they're not really one or the other, like many people get taught at university.
Interesting.
It doesn't just flip. I think that's just an easy way to teach it, but not accurate in real life. So a good example is you consume something that is toxic, say, anything like mercury or lead or something, and your body goes, that's not meant to be here. That first point is the vagus nerve activating, unless it's through the sinuses, and then that's the trigeminal nerve, but it's sensing that there is something wrong. And then the body then initiates a vomiting reflex, and you probably know that often even your temperature will go up, or you'll even have a higher heart rate. And that is the sympathetic nervous system for the heart rate, and the vomiting reflex is the parasympathetic vagal system. So they're two active at the same time. Interesting. People's heart rates do go up while they're eating often, and that is the sympathetic nervous system generating a higher heart rate, and the parasympathetic nervous system is digesting. So it's interesting that people like to make them binary, but they aren't. So when it comes to sort of their functions, the sympathetic nervous system has three main roles. When it's active, this is how it's taught, this is why it's not quite accurate. When it's active, generally, it inhibits the gut. So if you go and eat something and then go and exercise, well, you need the fight or flight system to exercise, because you need a higher heart rate, so it needs to activate, and that should give you indigestion. And generally it does. But the body is very intelligent. So when you're eating, it knows you're consuming food, and it may raise the heart rate for essentially improve the amount of blood going to the gut. But that process is dedicated to consuming food. You then go and do some other process where the needs are different, and then you might see this so-called inhibition effect on the gut. The vagus nerve's role in the heart is actually to bring the heart rate down when needed, right? So one of the great ways that it does that is it can actually tell when the heart rate is too high. It does this through blood pressure normally, somewhat through heart rate, but it definitely is through blood pressure. So for example, when you exert yourself and your blood pressure rises beyond what is required or appropriate or safe, the vagus nerve can tell that because it has receptors in the arterial walls. These are called baroreceptors, and they tell the brain or the vagus nerve that the pressure is too high and we need to lower it. So then it lowers the heart rate and lowers the heart contractility and relaxes the arterial wall. And so that's one way that the vagus nerve is involved in bringing our heart rate down. Then you also have its role in the lungs. Right? So when the sympathetic nervous system is activated, say adrenaline, you get this great effect where your lungs dilate and you get lots more oxygen in, so that you can carry that to the muscles, and you can, run away from that tiger as part of a fight or flight response, right? Or exercise. Whereas the vagus nerve, what it does, and it never explains why, but it causes what's called bronchoconstriction. And so that is that it constricts the bronchial tubes. But that never made a lot of sense to me, kind of like, why would you want that? Why wouldn't you always want lots of oxygen? Well, turns out it only does that in certain circumstances. It does that when you breathe in an irritant. And when you learn about what else it does in the lungs, you realize why that makes sense. So it also makes your lung tissue produce mucus. And as soon as that irritant, it might be a bit of smoke, like particulate matter, and it gets on the lung lining, and it activates one of those irritant receptors that the vagus nerve has there, which is pretty cool. It's able to sort of sense what comes into the lungs, whereas the sympathetic nervous system just dilates it. So it's a bit more the simplistic role there. But the vagus nerve is able to go, we don't want that in here. So then what it does is it will activate coughing. And coughing also includes bronchoconstriction. So the bronchioles contract and it expels as well as you cough. So you create this pressure gradient where the pressure is higher in the lungs than outside the body. So it thrusts things out through that pressure gradient. And then it also, long term, you'll start to produce more mucus. The vagus nerve goes to these things called hair-like cells. And they're like hairs, and they flick mucus upwards. Pretty cool. And that pressure gradient increases. So you might see this with asthma. People who get asthma are actually trying to expel irritants. And that's what asthma really is. It's not even aberrant, really. It's just a really extreme way of getting rid of stuff out of your lungs, truthfully. If we know that and we use that opportunity to eliminate what's in our lungs, you'll probably find that bronchoconstriction does come down a bit and normalize. Asthma is a bit of a tricky one because there's lots of different types of asthma, but generally speaking, that can be beneficial, having a mild amount of asthma to expel things. And then there are extreme cases of asthma where it's actually nothing to do with that, actually to do with the vagus nerve being dysfunctional and being what's called overactive. So a lot of these nerves can become overactive, underactive. So we're going to focus on the autonomic nervous system today. You have the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic. You could just say vagus nerve and sympathetic. And they, in some ways, counter each other, right? So when the sympathetic nervous system is overactive, that's very similar to saying that the vagus nerve is underactive. It's not quite accurate, but it's similar, right? So a lot of people are that in their problem is more that the sympathetic nervous system is quite overactive, in their vagus nerve is underactive. So all the great things the vagus nerve does normally, it's not doing very well. And so that's how it tends to be represented as someone who's overly stressed.
Okay.
Then you've got the type that's actually can't mount stress responses. So they have overactive vagal systems and underactive sympathetic nervous systems. And they're a very different case, but they both can be caused by very similar things, one of which is damage to the vagus nerve or compression to the vagus nerve. And that's where most of what I talk about lies, is in these two phenomena. So damage to the vagus nerve and compression to the vagus nerve, leading to these really strange symptoms that are generally unexplained by most people.
Yeah. So, yeah, interesting. I love how you think outside the box on so much of this. And I think just listening to you, I can really tell that you have this understanding that, you know, the body is always out to heal ourselves. It would never do anything. Even though those symptoms might sound negative, they're actually, I just said, a little bit of a signal going, hang on, something's not quite right. So on that note, how do you assess if somebody has a damaged vagus nerve? And I suppose how could that correlate with our listeners, that obviously most of them are suffering from absolutely relentless fatigue, all sorts of things going on with gut dysfunctions, which, you know, there's so many different causes for these types of things. But yeah, I'm intrigued as to how, if someone comes in, they're a shift worker, how do you assess that they've had a damaged vagus nerve that might be exasperating their symptoms?
Yep. So the first thing you do is you take someone's history, you get an idea of their symptomatic picture. You know, what's their heart rate generally, what's their blood pressure, what's their gut motility. You know, are they favoring more constipation, or have they got more diarrhea? They go to the toilet 3 or 4 times a day. Do they get, there's some symptoms that are very clearly overactive vagal symptoms. For example, strictures in the esophagus. So where their esophagus just cramps, an overactive vagal response. Then you've got just general malaise and fatigue. This is a symptom you can get with low vagal tone and high vagal tone for different reasons. So the sympathetic nervous system is one of the things that most people talk about in this. So not enough sympathetic activity leading to fatigue. But you'll have a bunch of people that have really low vagal tone, and it doesn't explain that situation. And the reason that I think that these people have those fatigue symptoms is still vagal, but it's because their digestion was insufficient. So they just don't absorb food properly. And that's pretty self-evident. They tend to have pretty poor digestive enzyme releases in their tests, blood tests and gut tests and things like that. They don't seem to be digesting food in these tests, and they often have bloating and things like that. So things just don't move through properly and get digested and adequately. And most of that's occurring in the stomach and duodenum. That's where it all goes wrong. And that area is just exclusively, as far as digestion is concerned, exclusively innervated by the vagus nerve. All those enzymes being released via a vagal response, it's called. And if you don't get good vagal input and activity there, you're going to get virtually minimal digestion. So that could be one of the symptoms they present with. But there's all these symptoms and that you can kind of put them in a category. So they tend to fall into one or the other pretty obviously, but there is another subcategorization. One is that they have, because the vagus nerve goes to the gut, the lungs, and the heart as a sort of a three-way, but there is others organs as well. The gut pathway can be hyperactive or underactive, and you may actually get the inverse in the heart. You may actually get, because they're a separate pathway, a separate nerve actually, the heart vagal tone may be different. And so you can't use one to measure the other. So one way that a lot of people measure their vagal systems is through a thing called heart rate variability. And this is a test to see when your heart rate's beating, beat, space, beat, it's generally the variation in the space between beats, which essentially, to put it, because it's a very, very complicated measurement done by an ECG. So, or you can get tools to do it at home, which are very effective, like your Apple Watch or your Oura Ring and all sorts of hoop straps.
Yep.
They're useful, but you need to do them over a week or more to get a really clear understanding of your heart rate variability. And what this measurement really is showing you is how healthy your autonomic nervous system is, but only really in regards to the heart. So I don't use it per se as a gold standard like it's talked about. I just use it as another test. And if they have something wrong with it, like it's too high or too low, we can then use it as a measurement for improvement. But I'll explain it this way. Your heart needs to go high and it needs to go low. It needs to be able to do that easily and upon the need arising, right? Mm-hmm. So you go to move fast or eat or do something where your heart rate needs to rise. It does that, and it has a good ability to be flexible, to go close together beats, which is a faster heart rate, and wider apart beats, which is a slower heart rate. And so there's a variation in that space throughout the day, throughout the week. While you sleep, of course, that gets wider. While you're active, it gets more narrow. Yeah. And so we want to see there's a good variation between those two. If there isn't much of a variation, then you have a low heart rate variability. Okay. And how I would look at that is that your autonomic nervous system's peak is insufficient and or your trough is insufficient. You don't have flexibility in the system. And that's a very good way to explain what that really is. So it also can say whether you have good sympathetic nervous system function too. So if you don't have the ability to rise to the situation, it can present as well in that heart rate variability. So I use it as a measurement with, if the heart's involved. Tachycardia, so any kind of heart rate is a good measurement, and blood pressure. Again, those three measurements: heart rate variability, blood pressure, and heart rate. Gut motility I measure through just listening to bowel sounds and intestinal sounds at different points of the gut. And what's really cool is when you start to do vagus nerve stimulation, you can hear an immediate increase in inaudible sounds of the gut. It's pretty obvious that that's occurring because it'll go from about a minute's worth of listening, very little sounds in those very low motility cases, to you do a bit of electrical vagus nerve stimulation or vibrational based stimulation, and all of a sudden you're hearing sounds.
Wow. So
it's pretty cool. Yeah. And I don't use that as a gold standard test because it's subjective. But I still think it's useful, and I use it in conjunction with everything else. The other test that I do is where I measure heart rate and then I stimulate the vagus nerve quite high up, either through vibration or electric current, and I see whether the heart rate responds. And so if it responds by lowering, the heart rate lowers when the vagus nerve is active, then it shows to me that pathway from where I'm stimulating to the heart is clear. And there's very minimal damage in it. And so that's very useful if I'm trying to find where the problem is. And then I do that on both sides. And once I figure out that pathway is clear, generally therapies work pretty well. If somebody doesn't have a clear pathway, either due to damage or compression, then it's much harder because there's a problem with the system itself, not that the vagus nerve is underactive or not. It just, you can't get the information through. It's kind of like you can turn the tap on, but if something's standing on the hose, it won't get through. And that's basically what that test is all about, figuring out where the problem is and can we rectify it. So then I can go and start treating the pathway. And then once that pathway is clear, we can really get into stimulating that autonomic nervous system, parasympathetic and sympathetic, depending on the situation.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? It helps us sort of appreciate how our bodies are truly amazing, and we are really like these electrical beings. Yeah, yeah, I agree. Is that
Yeah, well, we are very electrical. I mean, it seems that nerves are highly susceptible to many different environmental factors,
yeah,
so
yeah.
like sunlight.
Mm,
If we don't get enough sunlight, our autonomic nervous system just doesn't function properly at all. If we don't even, and cosmic radiation is another one that I mention a lot of my posts. If we don't get adequate cosmic radiation from the universe, from our outer space, and comes in and throughout the day and even at night, it's throughout the day and night, it's not just the day. So that's essentially just outdoor time.
yeah,
We don't have good heart rate variability. So, for example, if you're indoors all day,
yeah,
you might still get good sunlight, but you don't get enough cosmic radiation. For some reason, the cosmic radiation regulates our autonomic function, particularly our vagal function. It's pretty cool. So, like,
mm,
uh, you could say there's someone that stays indoors for hours, 1 hours, their heart rate variability is likely lowering. And so they're not flexible enough to deal with any situation that comes about, whether it be food or whether it be a stressor like having to run, having to
yeah,
exercise or something like that. So they're not prepared.
yeah,
So the more time we spend outside, we're more prepared for really anything, whether it be digestion, whether it be a stress response or anything. We're using our brain. Actually, we can get into the role of these systems in regulating brain function. But any kind of cognitive task may be more difficult to do. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And that's one of the things I do recommend to my clients is that we need to be getting outdoors more because we spend about 90% of our time indoors, which is not healthy. And I think we're getting accustomed to sort of sitting in this cave-like environment and then told we should be taking these vitamin D supplements, but that's
Mm.
really just a proxy marker of sunlight. It's not, you can't capture sunlight in a pill because of all the frequencies, the different colors, it all is. I think you can fall into that habit that if I just take this pill, it's going to make me healthy. So I love that you've really touched on that, Emrys. So my question on to that then, does the vagus nerve have a circadian component? Because we know pretty much every tissue, cell, organ in our body has these clocks that help to harness this amazing circadian rhythm that's got going in our body. Does the vagus nerve operate on a similar time? I'm thinking it must do because it's another organ effectively, isn't
Well,
it?
yeah, yeah. I mean, so of course we have our master clock in the
Yeah,
hypothalamus, the suprachiasmatic nucleus.
right. Yeah.
It's taking in all the input zeitgebers, things like light when we ate
Mm.
food, things like that. Predominantly light though.
Mm.
And then it tells the vagus nerve because there's a huge amount of wiring between this nucleus and the vagus nerve pathways,
Mm-hmm.
and that means that it's tuning the vagus nerve. So it tell every 24-hour period there's an update on what's the sleep wake cycle. What's this diurnal pattern that we are dealing with right now? Have we moved cities? Have we gone in a plane somewhere? Have we whatever? Have we had a disturbance by having too much light at night? Have we really
Mm.
changed the way our
Yeah.
FCN has kind of regulated
Yeah.
when midday is? And so the vagus nerve changes behavior based on that for a 24-hour period. And this is the local clock cells. So, clock cells are updated by the master clock. So it's rectifiable, but it's heavily influenced by changes in the sleep-wake cycle. So
Yeah.
if the vagus nerve, we know that most vagal processes have a time limit. It's somewhere in the realm of 12 to 10 hours. So as soon as you initiate a vagal response, as far as the gut's concerned, it has like a 10 to 12-hour period of optimal function. And then thereafter, it starts to have to downregulate to essentially shift to kind of be prepared to do it again. It needs a break.
Mm.
So, peak enzymatic activity is for the 10 to 12 hours after initiation of using the vagus. So if you have a cup of coffee in the morning, you're going to initiate a vagal response because coffee, not only is coffee digest, you have to use your liver to sort of detoxify from it, you could say. The taste of coffee is quite bitter, particularly if you have black coffee, and that activates the vagus nerve quite a lot. anything that's bitter will activate that vagal response, and then you initiate the clock, that so-called clock cells of the vagal system. Of course, it's influenced by light, but if you don't utilize that 10 to 12 hour period for eating food, you're going to get insufficient function of the vagus nerve thereafter. And that's only really the gut pathway. Remember, it's dependent on where the vagus nerve is not one system.
Yeah.
It's lots of arms off, that octopus, there's 8 arms, it's just, it has lots of different individual functions and not one system. So just because of that doesn't mean its role in the lungs changes in any way.
Yeah.
Or the heart. Okay. But yeah, it's very much guided by the sleep-wake cycle and the exposure to light, and it will underfunction when that goes haywire, for sure. Yeah.
So knowing that and knowing your audience, a very disrupted sleep pattern, unfortunately, for various different reasons, and some of it is changeable and others aren't because of the different rosters that they're working. If you've got a shift working patient that comes in to see you, what would be some of your, I guess, top sort of 3 recommendations to support their nervous system in that way and to support the optimal functioning of their vagus nerve? Because knowing that they're going to be doing things back to front.
Yeah, it's tricky. Heliotherapy is obviously a huge part of any shift worker's kind of approach, you could say, whether using an artificial light or real light. More outdoor time, even at night. If it's at night time, the more outside time they get, either prior to bed or in the morning, that will modulate that autonomic nervous system function. The problem is if they're not getting enough sleep, they're, working through the night with artificial light, they're going to dysregulate their vagus nerve to the point where it could eventually affect their heart and cause blood pressure issues, because we know that shift workers tend to have lower heart rate variabilities. And that's often associated with disease. I can explain why that is. It's not just associated. The vagus nerve disruption is causing the diseases.
Yeah.
Okay. But anything the vagus nerve does, generally speaking, if you have a disturbed sleep-wake cycle, will be suppressed. There is a situation where they have vagus nerve damage, and that's a whole other kettle of fish. They might have excessive vagal activity, so their bad symptom might be they constantly get diarrhea, or they've got constant nausea, because nausea is a vagal symptom. The vagus nerve is required to feel nausea.
Okay. Night shift nausea is a big one.
Yeah. And vomiting, of course, with that. So vomiting response is a vagal response. So if someone's in a either excessive vagal or low vagal state, either way, it can be disturbed by this aberrant sleep-wake cycle. And then what you do, well, you've got to do everything you can to improve your heart rate variability or your vagal tone in general, or autonomic function, however you want to say it, right? So I've mentioned outdoor time. Sunlight in the morning, or whenever you have to be awake, you need light in your eyes for at least 15 to 20 minutes to get a good amount of time where your body's cortisol and adrenaline is regulated, and that you don't get too much aberrant vagal activity. So if you have an overactive vagus nerve, it's very possible that you have an underactive sympathetic nervous system. So the best way to deal with that is to get sunlight in those eyes. And you could do exercise, but often people are too tired to do that. But they're not too tired to get sunlight.
Good point.
Then you can do a bunch of different things to stimulate appropriate vagal health and heart rate variability and autonomic nervous system function. One is cold water immersion, but on the face. So cold shower on the face is a great way to do that. You can do that for a few minutes. You can do it with an ice bucket, so just a bucket of ice with water, and place your face in it. I know it sounds crazy, but it's called the mammalian dive reflex, and it immediately regulates your autonomic function. You could do it with a pool. You could just jump in the pool or in the ocean. It's a great way to get autonomic function to start regulating. That one's strange, but it actually makes sense when you consider the receptors in the face are highly linked with the vagus nerve. They're not the same receptors, but they are linked. Then you have things like gargling. Gargling is useful to a point, but I don't actually find it ever really fixes anyone. Gargling is a common vagal stimulant exercise people do. I don't find it to be the be-all and end-all. Another really good thing that people can do is just simply grounding. So going and putting their feet on the actual earth.
Yeah.
This is not specifically vagal, but it's actually regulatory for the nervous system. And whether it's elimination of electrons or some other process, I consistently see it work with patients. And that's non-specific approach, that one, but it's useful. The bitter foods one is actually quite effective. The more bitter foods someone has when they need to eat, so it might be grapefruit juice, it might be bitter coffee, anything bitter essentially is going to stimulate the vagus nerve. Another great thing that stimulates the vagus nerve is fat. There is a therapy that I do with some people where I just get them to incrementally increase the amount of fat they have per day, because when fat gets into the stomach and the duodenum, you get this release of a thing called cholecystokinin and CCK, and that's extraordinarily stimulatory for the vagus nerve. In fact, it can actually change your heart rate variability over a long period of time.
Wow.
So stimulation of the vagus nerve through fat consumption, and I'm referring to things like butter, tallow, coconut oil and olive oil, things like that, not seed oils. I wouldn't go near that. So, you could do it through just like a teaspoon a day or half a teaspoon and incrementally increase, because if you don't have good bile function, you're going to get a lot of nausea, and I don't recommend it. And I think that's why a lot of people who have those bulletproof coffees have got good effects, because one, they got the fat and they got the coffee, and both are vagal stimulants. I think that's probably why bulletproof coffees are effective at improving health. I'm just thinking about things that really that can be done easily, but then you get to things where, they actually need a clinician's approach, clinical approach. So you'll have things where the damage is there, they need therapies to stimulate healing of the nerve, and that's very feasible now. I didn't think it was possible a few years back, but now I have methods that are working. Whereas back then, it wasn't really many options, but there are more now. It's good. Compression syndromes of the vagus nerve are common in people. They just don't know it, but then they go and do shift work. And then those very minor symptoms of the vagus nerve they have from compression syndromes or damage become ever present, because they put strain on the autonomic nervous system. So a lot of people have these vagal symptoms and they're not aware of it. They're very low level. They might be 5%, 10% compression, loss of function. And then they go and push themselves as far as the autonomic nervous system is concerned, and then they become very present. That's probably why some people who do shift work aren't as affected by it as others, because some people have actual vagus nerve damage or vagus nerve compression already pre-existing, and then thereafter they have problems because of that. Some people are actually born with it because of damage to their autonomic nervous system in utero. Pretty much anything that can cause someone, anything that can cause someone to have a preterm birth, so smoking, alcohol consumption of the mother, any kind of domestic violence present, drug use, all sorts of little, obvious things that can cause preterm births are the same things that can damage the autonomic nervous system of a baby in utero. And so these babies then are born with problems. They don't sleep properly. They often have a lot of reflux, and they often have gut problems. And most babies don't get their heart rate variability checked at birth, but you would know that their heart rate variability would have been very low relative to a healthy baby.
Wow.
So there's a few things. It gets more specific of what to do based on the type of problem you have.
Yeah.
But those ones are the most common ones I give out.
Yeah, I think, upon reflection now, when I look back at when I first started shift work, I think I wish somebody had sort of been teaching me or raising awareness about the importance of really nurturing and nourishing our nervous system, because, a shift working role really, it gets brutally, and then not to mention, those, the mums that are working shift work as well as raising, children, young kids. I remember a girl I used to work with, came in for like a 3 a.m. start, and she'd barely had an hour and a half sleep because she'd been up all night nurturing. Yeah, it's a crazy thing, and I think a lot of shift workers too kind of run on adrenaline, like they push, and they're not really listening to what's kind of going on with their body, and so we miss those signals or those sorts of things that you've been mentioning.
It's a complete mismatch, it's a complete environmental switch mismatch. And people are ignoring everything to do that role and that work. And when you ignore the body, what the body needs at that time or wants to do, you're ignoring your body's innate sensibility and intelligence, which is very problematic, and it does lead to disease. And that's where a lot of people ignore their body. I'm not saying ignore symptoms. I think a lot of symptoms aren't actually symptoms. They're just the body fixing itself. It's just that they're misunderstood. But if you do what you feel you need to do in that moment, for example, lie down, sleep, or get out and get some sunlight, it's probably the most appropriate. But some people actually are taking medication, and that medication disturbs those signals. So it can mean that they want to do something, but it's actually the not appropriate thing to do. So as soon as you add something into the body, it could be a supplement too, you actually may get the wrong signals, and that's a problem because then you can't trust yourself. But I think a lot of people, what they do in general is people focus, particularly in the nutrition world, they focus on the hormonal endocrine system and immune system so much they forget that what system precedes it. Without a nervous system, those two systems just don't function. And they literally do not function. They have there is no energetic component to them other than the nervous system. It's called the neuroendocrine and neuroimmune interfaces. Without the nervous system, there's no real instigation of anything, right? So, for example, the immune system only responds essentially to the role of neurological receptors, right? So without the neurological receptors, the immune system doesn't know what the hell's going on. And then same with endocrine, like without these receptors or these neurological feedback systems, endocrine systems such as the HPA axis or the gonadal or the thyroid axis don't have any kind of role to play. Like they're inert. So everyone focuses on the nutrition, like zinc with thyroid, but they don't realize that the thyroid gland is activating this, is priming the sympathetic nervous system, and it tends to be people with dysregulated autonomic nervous systems, and the body's trying to fix the problem through hormones. And so, when there's not enough sympathetic outflow for somebody, and a lot of people call this that they've been stressed for so long and all sorts of things. Well, the job of the sympathetic nervous system is inadequate in certain people. So what they'll do, the body will actually increase the amount of thyroid hormone, and then you'll get this increase in sympathetic activity. And that may be appropriate in that situation, something like Graves' disease. Or there's too much sympathetic activity due to low vagal activity, as an example. And the body may actually decide, no, let's lower the sympathetic activity through lowering our thyroid hormone. And that's the body's having an intelligence to do so. But we can't, if we only focus on hormones, we're obviously not dealing with the root cause, because the body is trying to fix the situation. So fixing its fix will only lead to essentially downstream problems.
Yeah, gosh. Yeah, there's so much that we could pull apart from what you've just
it's a big topic, Sarah.
spoken. No, that's great. And it certainly has opened my eyes a little bit more from the correlation with the nervous system and the circadian timing system that, the body's trying to get through natural ways, trying with the light or our timing of our food intake, trying to send us a signal. But if we're not getting that signal because our nervous system's not working correctly, it's a bit like a insulin resistant, leptin kind of, a resistant nervous system resistance kind of response, isn't it? But I guess, so I'm just a bit mindful of the time, because we can talk about this for ages, but I did, just before we wrap up, Emerys, I just wanted to touch on, because that conversation is a little bit of a segue into a a question that or a comment that I wanted to raise is that around this something called the new biology, because I know a growing number of healthcare practitioners worldwide, and this is including myself as well. We are challenging the status quo when it comes to our healthcare system and what we've been taught. Could you share a little bit more about that and your perspective?
Yeah, so in the new biology kind of movement, you could say, or paradigm, the change of idea is that the body is consistently trying to do the right thing, trying to resolve whatever's going on. And most of what it's trying to resolve is it's trying to keep the system clean of contaminants. And our environment is full of contaminants, toxins, and those toxins are really what the problem is. But there is a little caveat to this, little side thing that a lot of people aren't aware of, and that is that these toxins can damage the vagus nerve. And as soon as you damage that vagus nerve, this is, my belief of this is quite broad, but I'll just get down to the business of the vagus nerve. As soon as you take out the vagus nerve due to damage, due to environmental toxicity, or it could be from drugs, it could be from a surgery, iatrogenic causes. There's a lot of causes of damage to the vagus nerve, right? But let's just say someone has that, right? And that's very common. I see it every day in my clinical practice. What then happens is their ability to recognize, isolate, and detoxify or eliminate these toxins becomes suppressed because it's no longer as responsive as it was because it's damaged. And this is the first problem, is the loss of sensation, the loss of ability to sense when things have arrived in the body.
Yeah.
So, we say in the new biology movement that most things are to do with trauma, emotional trauma, physical, and toxicity, give or take deficiency of nutrients. Now, toxicity is the main problem. It's the main game. Whether it be plastics, whether it be EMF radiation to a certain extent, mostly to do with close exposure with mobile phones, whether it be environmental toxins relating to organophosphate exposure, whether it be in the water, whatever, pharmaceutical drugs in the water, fluoride. I think fluoride needs to be removed. It's now got more and more papers coming out showing its negative effect on children and in utero, and it's one of the main causes of autonomic dysfunction in utero and birth onwards. Maybe not in adults, but certainly in children because of their size relative to the toxin. So in the new biology, basically, my 2 cents is that the vagus nerve can be damaged, and our ability to recognize, detoxify, and eliminate these toxins becomes really problematic because the vagus nerve is involved in every single step of detection, isolation, and elimination and biotransformation of all toxins in the gut, in the lung lining, in the throat, and in the brain too. So the truth is that detoxification is a vagal process. You wouldn't really call it anything else because you would say in between 90 and 95% of activities of detoxification and everything preceding it is vagal. So if something's wrong with the vagus nerve, you're not going to eliminate adequately and you're going to get sicker. You're just going to defer the toxicity to another way of dealing with it.
Yeah.
And that in some circumstances is cancer. In other circumstances, it's cardiovascular disease. In other circumstances, it's dementia. In other things, it might be relating to damage to an organ long term. And I explain this more in depth in my talks. But if we get the toxicity problem first, and then the damage to the nerve and the sensing of what's going on in the body, there's no way our body would know. And so it's like an insidious invader. It's got in through a back passage into the castle, and our main forces are unable to meet it. And so it takes a while, but then eventually it's going to harm us. And we need to build our vagal systems back up again if we're going to fight these toxins in our environment. Of course, we want to eliminate the toxins as much as possible, do our own versions of detoxification, enhanced detoxification as much as possible. eliminate the toxins in the air in our environment, our food and water and so on. But if our vagal systems aren't working, it may be to no avail.
Yeah, which is, for most people, they'd be blissfully unaware of that concept. So I'm glad that you're kind of shining the light on this. And I think the title of your book, Unleashing the Body's Secret Weapon Against Disease, kind of alludes us into, shining the light on that scenario. So fascinating stuff. I've certainly learnt a bit talking to you today, Emrys, as I'm sure our listeners are too. My brain's kind of ticking over with a few different things kind of going on. But is there anything, before we wrap up, is there anything that you'd like to add that I may have missed in asking a question that you think would be valuable for our listeners to know? Anything to do with like the nervous system, the vagus nerve?
Yeah, so, our body needs things that it generally doesn't get, you can't, many of you won't be able to fix your vagus nerve at home right now, but there are things you can do now. You can go outside, I mentioned that. You can drink as clean water as possible. Breathe in the fresh air, if hopefully it's fresh around where your house is.
Yeah.
Move more. Nervous system is a system of blood flow. It improves its function as your blood flow increases. And your movement increases, and that's how it functions. Without that blood flow, it starts to have a bit of an impairment in its function. Sunlight, without a doubt, improves the function of our vagal system, our autonomic nervous system, and just being outside. So, like I said, cosmic radiation sounds a bit ambiguous; you can't see it, but being outside is healing. So, I highly recommend get back to nature, go outside, walk, go for a hike, just do things that are health promoting, and all those other things that you do that are negative for your health, and maybe offset somewhat. And I think that's where we need to get started, something easier to implement now. And then later we can deal with the more complexities of people's issues in face-to-face clinical situations.
Yeah, brilliant advice. I think the further we move away from nature, the sicker we've become, unfortunately. Exactly. Yeah, and from a practical perspective, I think that's really great advice, even if looking at their days off, because sometimes, depending on their shifts, they're obviously half at work or half too tired to do anything in the afternoon. But even if they put somewhere on the roster that they're going to go on a bushwalk or something like that, or it can be locally as well. It's just getting outside from these four walls, and particularly those that work in call centres and hospitals. They're under relentless artificial light constantly. There's a real disconnect going on, which is, without a shadow of a doubt, no doubt, impacting on the nervous system as well. So, well, thank you so much for joining me today, Emrys. For those of our listeners that would like to learn more about your work, maybe from a clinical perspective, I know that you've just started your own podcast and obviously your book. Where can they get in contact with you?
So my website is emrysgoldsworthy.com.au. Yeah. And then I've got social media, just Emrys Goldsworthy on Instagram and Facebook. I run a group about the vagus nerve. It's under the title of my own book, The Vagus Nerve. And you'll find that on Facebook. And that's a great place to learn more about the vagus nerve and ask questions. And my website has, all the details of my clinic and my book and any clinician courses coming up.
Yeah, that's great. And it's awesome, obviously, being an ex-lecturer, that you do trainings for, clinicians as well. So you're really, you're juggling so much going on. It's, it's extraordinary. But so thank you very much for taking the time to join me, Emrys. As I said, I've certainly learned a lot, and as I'm sure our listeners have as well. And I'll certainly make sure to put the links to all of your website details on the show notes as well.
Great. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for joining us. That wraps up another episode of the Healthy Shift Worker podcast. Please feel free to share this podcast with those that you think might benefit. Leave us a rating or a comment, as this will help me to be able to reach more shift workers like yourself to help to improve their health and well-being. Until next time, we'll see you then.